questions can be a really powerful thing. For instance, when the officer pulls you over and says, "Sir, did you know you were speeding?" No, officer, I didn't. We've been seeking to answer a really important question throughout the first half of the Gospel of Mark. And it's really a question that's been preceded by a lot of questions about Jesus. For instance, all the way back in chapter 1, in verse 27, after Jesus has cast out his first unclean spirit in the Gospel, the crowd's amazed and they questioned among themselves, saying, "What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." Or in chapter 2, after Jesus has healed the paralyzed man who's been let down through the roof and forgiven him of his sins, and the man walks out of the house, and the scribes are stunned, and they ask, "Why does this man speak like this? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Or what about that time when the disciples and Jesus were out on the lake in the middle of a storm, and they woke Jesus up, frantic that their boat was going to sink, and of course Jesus calmed the storm, and the disciples, fearful after the entire scene, asked the question, "Who then is this that even wind and sea obey him?" And of course there was that time in Nazareth, right? Just a chapter or two later, when Jesus was rejected by his hometown and by his own family members. And we read all of these questions. And on the Sabbath he began to teach in the synagogue. And many who heard him were astonished, saying, "Where did this man get these things? What is the wisdom given to him? How are such mighty works done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother James, and Joseph, and Judas, and Simon? And are not these his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. Well, all of those questions kind of culminate in that one big question we've been seeking to answer as we've walked our way through the first half of the Gospel of Mark, namely, who is this Jesus? And when we enter into our text this morning, we find that Peter culminates all of these questions in answer to a question from Jesus himself. Verse 27 of Mark chapter 8. "And Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, 'Who do people say that I am?'" Jesus is pretty much a rock star at this point, okay? He's been traveling throughout the region of Galilee, healing people, and teaching with authority, and demonstrating his authority over the unseen spiritual world. And naturally, there are stories about Jesus. There are opinions about Jesus. And the disciples have heard those. So they say, well, some people say you're John the Baptist. Some people say you're Elijah the prophet. And others, well, they just think you're one of the prophets. But then Jesus asks the all-important question. The question that every single person is confronted with. The question that all disciples of Jesus must answer. Who do you say that I am? You see, the question is not a general one in terms of, okay, so who is this Jesus? Mark gives us enough clues and enough hints and enough pictures of the authority of Jesus for us to come to a definitive conclusion. The real question, however, is a more personal one. Once you've read through this first half of the Gospel of Mark, the question really is, who do you say that Jesus is? And right here is the high mark of the first half of the Gospel. Peter answered, "You are Christ." In other words, you are the long-promised Israel. You are the one whom God promised ages ago to send in order to set God's people free from all of their captivities. We believe that you are him. That's really the answer to the question, who is this Jesus? He's the King of all kings. He's the Lord of all lords. He's the long-awaited Messiah, come to rescue the people of God. But what's interesting is Peter only understands that up to a point, right? And as we jump into the second half of Mark, you're going to see things take a turn, okay? Especially in this middle section from 8:27 all the way through the end of chapter 10. And because I'm a visual learner, I gave everybody a little graphic, a chart, that will help you kind of see where things are going. Because here's what happens. Peter confesses Jesus as the Christ, and the next 2.5 to 3 chapters or so are Mark's answer to the next question. Well, okay, Jesus is the Christ. What does it mean for him to be the Christ? What does it mean for him to be the King of Israel? And then Jesus is going to begin to unpack that with his disciples as they begin to change direction from ministry in Galilee and turn their focus toward Jerusalem. Verse 31. And Jesus began to teach them. Now, y'all know, as well as I do, if you've been here for any length of time, that the disciples have demonstrated all kinds of hard-headedness, which essentially amounts to knuckleheadedness. Right? They just don't understand. But Jesus is patient. Jesus is kind. Jesus is compassionate. And so here, Jesus begins, he enters into a process of teaching them what it means for him to be Messiah. He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Now, we don't necessarily hear those words in the same way that the disciples did, okay? They had a certain idea of what it meant for the Messiah to arrive on the scene and to take care of business. Right? In their minds and in their hearts, the Messiah was going to come as a triumphant figure, as someone who showed up on the scene with power and authority and glory and gave the Romans what for? Essentially booted them out of the country, gave Israel back to the Jewish people, and set himself up as king of the Jews with God at the very center of his people again, and all would be well. So when Jesus begins to teach them that the Messiah must suffer many things, well, there's really only one response, right? Verse 32. And he said this plainly. In other words, Jesus has been teaching in parables, right? Now he begins, in the company of his disciples, to speak clearly, plainly, and forthrightly about where things are headed. And Peter, having heard these things, took Jesus aside and rebuked him. Now, Peter's done this before, okay? But you got to imagine, right? Peter's heard all of this stuff about a suffering Messiah, and he says, whoa, 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 Jesus, we don't talk like that. That's not going to happen to you. Man, we got glory coming. We got a throne coming. We're going to see the Romans kicked out, and man, the good times are going to roll. Right? But he doesn't understand. He doesn't understand. And so, verse 33, but turning and seeing that his disciples are talking about these things, Jesus basically gets up in Peter's face and says, "Get behind me, Satan. For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. In other words, the messianic plans and purposes that Peter had for Jesus are not the messianic plans and purposes that God had for Jesus. Peter was thinking through a human lens based on his human understanding and his cultural understanding of who and what the Messiah was to be and to do. But it wasn't Jesus' plan. And it wasn't his purpose, and it wasn't his mission. In effect, here, Peter is standing in for the adversary of all adversaries. And he's trying once again to do what? To tempt Jesus to get off mission. To bypass the cross and all of the suffering that went with it. And Jesus straight up got in his face and said, Satan, you need to get behind me. You don't have in mind the things of God. Instead, you have in mind the things of men. Now, this prompts Jesus to enter into what I call discipleship 101 with his followers, okay? It prompts him to begin this journey of predicting his death 3 times over the course of 8:22 to 10:52, and then giving a corresponding discipleship teaching each time that he does that. You can see that on the chart that I've given you, okay? It kind of breaks down this section, really section by section, and helps you see what Jesus is doing. So what does the discipleship teaching look like here in response to this prediction of Jesus' death? Verse 34. And he called to him the crowd with his disciples and said to them, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. So Jesus, the Messiah who's going to die, calls all of his followers to join him on the way of the cross and embrace death too. Now, you and I, again, like the disciples, we don't hear this instruction about a cross the same way that they would have heard it. We wear crosses around our necks. We wear crosses as earrings. We have crosses up in our homes. We cross-stitch crosses. We have them on pillows, right? Like, it's not the kind of object of abuse. It's not the kind of object of social ostracism. It's not the kind of symbol of oppression that it was for the Jewish people. When the disciples heard Jesus say, if you're going to follow me, you got to deny yourself and take up your cross. They would have had all of this stuff in the background related to how this is the form of death that's reserved for the lowest of the low. For the lowest of the criminals, the lowest of the social outcasts. It was a vivid symbol of the fact that the Jewish people were always under the terror and the oppression of Rome. In fact, going back about 70 to 100 years before this time, a guy by the name of Spartacus. Anybody remember Spartacus? He led a slave rebellion against Rome, and Rome would not have it, and so a Roman general crucified him along with 6,000 of his followers. And the Roman general who did that lined the crosses on both sides of the road between Capua and Rome, so that to walk between them was to be reminded that if you mess with Rome, the imperial power, then what happens to you? You die. All right? So here into this context, Jesus says, if you're going to follow me, you have to lay down self-will, you have to lay down self-sufficiency, and you got to take up your cross, and you got to come after me. Meaning that you got to die to your plans, you got to die to your agenda, you got to die to the fact that you think you can make it through life with your own resources. You got to die to you if you're going to follow Jesus. And then you got to take up your instrument of death, and you got to come after him. Folks, the image of the cross signifies a total claim on the disciples' allegiance and a total relinquishment of resources to him. In other words, to be a disciple of Jesus is not as if you and I are watching Netflix and we have the choice of what we're going to watch next, right? It's not a both-and kind of thing where you get your cake and you eat it too. To be a follower of Jesus is an either-or prospect. You either follow after yourself and seek to build your own kingdom in your own way for your own glory and pleasure, or you lay it down. You lay it down and you seek to follow after him. Now notice what Jesus does. He gives 3 specific reasons for why we should embrace the way of the cross as disciples. Verse 35, he says, "For whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it." Now it's kind of backwards, right? We think, oh wow, in order to save my life, I have to protect my life. In order to save my life, I have to preserve my life. But Jesus says, those who want to save their lives will what? Lose their lives for his sake and for the sake of the gospel. It's a picture of what it means to surrender to Jesus, to lay it all at his feet and say, I'm yours and everything I have is yours. Look at the next picture, verse 36. "For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man gain in return for his life?" Jesus says essentially, you can take one of 2 paths. You can pursue greatness and glory and wealth and riches and fame and pleasure and all of the goods that this life has. You can go after them hard. You can go after them with everything you've got. But if you go that way, you can't go this way. You can't follow the way of the cross. But here's the end result. This over here, if you go this way, isn't worth forfeiting what's over here. To follow the way of the cross, though it might mean suffering and rejection now, what does it mean later? Glory. It means being in the presence of Jesus and resting for eternity with him. It's exactly what he says in the very next verse. "For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." In other words, it's another definitive life choice. You can either identify yourself with Jesus now and receive glory and praise and honor in his presence when he returns, or you can reject Jesus now and be rejected by Jesus later. It's a stark choice. Not a both and, but an either or. And brothers and sisters, that is discipleship 1 line to belong to Jesus. And it doesn't just mean that for pastors. It means that for anyone and everyone who says Jesus is Lord. That's what life for disciples looks like. Now there are some more specifics, particularly 2, in this particular section that define that further for us. Okay, what does it look like in your daily life and mine to surrender to Jesus? The next story is the story of the Transfiguration or transformation of Jesus. And it's directly connected to this one. All right, I want you to see it. Verse 2 of chapter 9. And after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became radiant, intensely white, as no one on earth could bleach. So here we are, it's 6 days after Peter's confession of Jesus as the Christ. The disciples are kind of reeling from this news that Jesus is going to be rejected and going to be killed. And he takes his 3 closest associates, James, John, and Peter, up onto a high mountain by themselves. And literally in front of their eyes, Jesus is transformed. Now, it wasn't as if somebody had spotlights up there and the spotlights shone on him from the inside. No. What Mark is saying is that the glory inside of Jesus began to show up on the outside. In other words, it's like Clark Kent opening the shirt and showing the Superman symbol, right? Like the glory is coming from inside of him, and it's coming from inside of him to the extent that it's not just his face and his body that are lit up like the sun, it's his clothing. That Mark tells us in specific detail becomes so white that no bleach on earth could get it white. Now, why did this happen for the sake of the disciples? All right? I have to imagine that at this point, after Jesus giving them this initial discipleship teaching, that they're a little nervous. In fact, they're even questioning whether or not he is the Messiah. Because the Messiah is not really supposed to suffer and to die. And so Jesus takes these 3 men who are closest to him up on the mountain. He shows them his glory as if to say, no, I really am who I'm telling you that I am. See for yourself. And then Moses and Elijah show up. They spend some time up on the mountain, but ultimately they disappear. And Jesus is left alone with the disciples, and a voice comes from heaven. Right? Look at verse 6. For he did not know what to say. This is Peter. For he and the other 2 men with him were terrified. And a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. Now, where have we last heard the voice from heaven speak over Jesus? At his baptism. Right? According to Mark, at that point, the voice was for Jesus' benefit. Here in the Gospel of Mark, the voice is for whose benefit? Disciples. Right? They need to hear at this point that Jesus is who he says he is, and they need to hear it ratified from heaven that he is who he says he is. And importantly, what does the voice instruct them to do? Listen. Listen to what he's telling you. He's telling you the truth about himself. You've just seen it on display. Listen to it. So in practical things, what does it look like to surrender to Jesus? It means you listen to him. It means you listen to him. You submit yourself to his word, and you surrender self-will and self-sufficiency by submitting yourself to his word. This book, brothers and sisters, from back to front, Genesis to Revelation, and every single word, sentence, paragraph, and all of it is the word about the word. It's the written word about the living word. And so God is calling us as followers of the Lord Jesus to listen. The question is, why don't we? Why don't we listen? Are we too busy? Are we too distracted? Y'all, I gotta admit to you, we live in a day of unmatched distractions. The internet's a gift, but it's a curse too. You can find out a lot of good things on there, but for me sometimes it's a rabbit hole. and I just fall down it, and I can't get out. I'll read one article, and then I'll see a link to the next article, and I'll click on that. And then I'll see a link to why this NBA star is the best player ever, and then I'll click on that. And then it's a link about this football player, or it's a link about this thing or that thing, or about, oh man, y'all. And then 2 hours have passed. It's so distracting. And I think so often it keeps me from listening to the Lord. Y'all, I think that's why in some ways silence and solitude is even more important in our time than it has been at other times. Because if you're going to listen to Jesus, you got to get to a place where you can hear Him. Where all of the distractions fade into the background, and it's you and it's His Word, and you're seeking His face. Sometimes I think we're just too comfortable doing our own thing in our own way for our own pleasure. And so it's easy just to stiff arm Jesus because I don't want to hear what He's going to tell me. Okay? Sometimes I think our propensity for foolishness keeps us from this Word. And it ought to drive us to it because we need wisdom. We need Jesus to teach us. To be a disciple is fundamentally to be a learner, a student who walks with Jesus, who listens to Him, who learns from Him, and who is grown into His image by doing so. To be a disciple of Jesus is first and foremost to be a listener. To be a listener. This is discipleship 101. But then you have this other follow-up story, okay? So, Jesus and His 3 closest associates have been up on the Mount of Transfiguration, and they begin to make their way back down into the valley. And once they're back down into the valley, they encounter this scene where the rest of the disciples are arguing with a group of scribes. And so we enter in there at verse 15. And when they came to the disciples, they saw a great crowd around them and scribes arguing with them. And immediately all the crowd, when they saw Him, were greatly amazed and ran up and greeted Him. They're like, okay, Jesus, we're so glad you're here. And you're going to find out why in just a minute. He asked them, what are you arguing about with them? So He steps into the middle of this conversation between the scribes and the Pharisees. He confronts the scribes and says, what are you guys arguing about with my disciples? Whatever you have to say to them, you can say to me. You take it up with me. Now, before we can get any further in terms of this back and forth, verse 17, and someone from the crowd answered, Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able. Now that's funny, because earlier Jesus had sent all of His disciples out 2 by 2 on this provisional mission, right? He had invested in them His personal authority and had sent them out to preach, to heal the sick, and to cast out demons. And guess what? They had done it. They had come back with all kinds of stories and excitement over what Jesus had done through them. But you get here, and the disciples have tried to cast out the unclean spirit from the little boy, but they can't. They can't do it. So what's going on? Now, I want you to see something. Jesus eventually does, in this story, cast out the unclean spirit. But at the end of the story, look at verse 28. And when He had entered the house, His disciples asked Him privately. All right, so we're out of the crowd. We're back into a private setting where Jesus is teaching His disciples. And His disciples, they're like all torn up about why they couldn't do it, okay? Why could we not cast it out? And He said to them, this kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer. Do you know what the disciples were doing? They were trying to cast out the unclean spirit without Jesus. They were trying to do it in their own strength, in their own power, according to past experience. Oh, well, we've done it before. How hard can it be? Oops is right. And my guess is they couldn't do it, and the scribes confronted them about it, and they were having an argument about how to best deal with unclean spirits. And here comes Jesus back into the conversation, not only to perform the miracle, but to remind his disciples, you cannot do anything without me. You cannot do anything without me. Now here's the fascinating thing. There's only one prayer in this story. One. Do you know who prays it? The father of the boy with the unclean spirit. Right? Look back into the middle of the story with me. Verse 21. And Jesus asked his father, how long has this been happening to you? And the father said, from childhood. And it's often cast him into fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And Jesus said to him, if you can, anything is possible for one who believes. Immediately the father of the child cried out and said, I believe, help my unbelief. Can't you just see a desperate father standing before Jesus, locking eyes with him, desirous of one thing, the healing of his son? And Jesus says to him, you got to have faith. You've got to trust that I have the ability and the power to heal you. And the guy says, look, I believe, but I'm still struggling. I got this mustard seed of faith. Will you grow it? Will you deepen it? Will you help me? Talk about an honest prayer, right? Talk about the prayer that says, Jesus, I'm just not there yet. Jesus, will you help me to believe you can do this? Doesn't that encourage you? Doesn't that comfort you? Doesn't that challenge you to go to the Lord even when you're struggling with doubts? Right? Like, you don't hide out from Jesus until you get it all together and say, okay, Lord, my confidence level's at 100% right now. Won't you go ahead and work? No. It's not the level of your faith that's the issue. It's the object of your faith. And Jesus will receive the one who has even a mustard seed size. He can work with this. He can work with the person who comes to him and says, Lord, okay, I trust you, but I'm still struggling. I trust you, but I'm still doubting. I trust you, but I'm still fearful. I trust you, but I'm still worried. Will you help me? Well, Jesus loves prayers like that. Jesus loves prayers. The question is, why don't we pray? Why don't we pray at all? I'm convinced it has to do with one of two things. Okay, both of them are present in this passage. Either like the disciples, we think we can handle it, whatever it is. Jesus, I got this. We're good. Or like the father of the demon-possessed boy, we're not sure that Jesus can handle it either. Okay? Whatever it is. And here's kind of the summary statement. We don't pray because we either overestimate ourselves or we underestimate God. We either overestimate ourselves or we underestimate God. But to be a disciple of Jesus, to be in relationship with Jesus, to be one who talks to Him, who hears from His Word, who responds to Him in prayer, that is what the life of a Christian is to be. Knowing Christ, in other words, is a two-way street. And it works the same way that other relationships work. He talks to us, we talk to Him. That's discipleship 101. And it's through listening to the Word and submitting ourselves to it. And it's through praying the kinds of prayers, whether they be prayers of weak faith or prayers of self-will submission, where we go, Jesus, it's not about me, it's about you, not my will, but your will. That's where we pick up the cross and learn to seek after Him, according to His will and His way and for His purpose. And here's the thing, and this is where we're going to close this one. A lot of this stuff can sound gloomy, right? Talk about taking up your cross and following Jesus. Just makes Christians often sound glum and ho-hum, and you just got to grin and bear. When that happens, it's because A, we don't realize who we're on the road with. Jesus says, follow me. And that's the place where you and I belong. That's the place where freedom from sin and guilt and shame and worry and fear and lust is found. Following after Jesus. But not only is it following Jesus, when you're there with Him on the way of the cross, you recognize, it's not really that heavy. Because guess what? He bears most of the weight. What does He say? What does He say in Matthew chapter 11? Come to me. And let this be an invitation to everyone here this morning, whether you know Jesus or you do not. Hear these words. He says, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. When you and I are taking up our crosses and following after Jesus, eventually, you know what you find out? And Jesus is the one who's carrying it. He's the one who's carrying it. And you find that that's the place of real freedom and real truth and real life. Let's pray. Father, thank you today for this opportunity to be in your word, to be listening to your voice. And now I pray as we approach you again in worship through song, that you'll help us all, each and every one here, wherever we are on our spiritual journeys, to respond accordingly. Father, I'm willing to bet that there's someone here this morning who needs to lay down fear, who needs to lay down worry, who's wrestling with lust, who's wrestling with anger. And God, you are calling those individuals to self-denial and to entrust themselves to you. And